Thank you, everyone. So I'll be giving a talk tomorrow about Elixir in production, and I wanted to I'm gonna take this because I don't really like it being here. Sorry. So I wanted to basically spend this 5 minutes looking at something that I bring up in passing with the talk, but something that's been really important for us at my job. So I work at SalesLoft. We heard Dan Dresselhaus give a talk earlier, awesome talk about state in general and in Elixir. We're also hiring if you're looking for anything, especially if you're in the Atlanta area. So I want to frame this problem real quick of what I'm going to talk about. So at SalesLoft, traditionally, we had the very common private API. We had a public API, but as the person who wrote the first pass of it, I'm qualified to say that it's not very good. And we were not letting people use our private API. It was for us, and we would do stuff like break it as we needed to. But we wanted to open up a public API. We wanted documentation and consistency. So that's for engineers and for customers who might be using it across our product and our microservices, which is going to go with our new language that we are introducing at the time, Elixir, sitting alongside our first language, Ruby, and engineers are having to switch back and forth between that as necessary based on the features that they're working on. And so this solution I'm going to talk about today, basically the goals of this were that the API and documentation cannot be out of sync, that it's 100% impossible for that to occur. That the documentation is auto-generated from source, and that the API implementation is separate from any particular framework, in this case being Rails and Phoenix, and I think Sinatra for one of our apps as well. So this inspiration, I don't know if you ever looked at Stripe's API, but it's pretty amazing because if you set up their API 5 years ago, it still works today. They don't break their API. So they have 90 versions of it or something like that, and they're continuously deploying to it. And also the other inspiration being the Rails/Phoenix is not your application mindset. So when looking at this and building out this public API and looking specifically around the best way we wanted to do it, we broke the API down into two concepts because it's a very RESTful API. Basically, you have methods and resources. In traditional, maybe like Rails or Phoenix view, you would have your controller actions would be your methods, and your resources for us would be like JSON output. This is for our API, which is JSON based. In our solution, input and output has to be documented in order to be available. So that means that if you want a parameter, you have to document that parameter. And if you're serializing something, the serializer is the thing that you write the documentation in. It dynamically generates a serializer. So they are intrinsically tied together. They can't be separate. And then we also can mark endpoints as internal because, of course, we don't want to build something and then from day one ship it out publicly. You need to have some bake-in time to make sure that your API is correct, and then that you're also happy with the the contract that you've established. So I want to look real quick at what a method would look like in Ruby, right? So you name this method by your resource, which is widgets in this case, and the thing it's doing, which is show. It is going to be a widget resource, so you sort of tell it what serializer to use, what resource it's going to use. In this case, we're documenting a path parameter called ID. So this would be for a traditional show route. And then just a very easy finder. This is in Rails, or in Rails particular, just doing a find on the widgets. But let's look real quick at how similar this is between this and Elixir. There's no inheritance, so we're using use, so a little bit of macros. Response resource, exactly the same line. Param, exactly the same line. Execute's a little bit different, but very similar. So the same engineer that's going in between these two apps are going to be able to basically, translate mentally between these two. At least that's what we found at SalesLoft between our application. Obviously, our APIs are usually more lines of code than this, and they also this has a lot more features that's not shown here. And then the resources. So this is essentially a serializer. In Rails, it actually dynamically creates an active model serializer behind the scene. And in Elixir, I used something that was similar, but let me basically dynamically build it up really easily. If you look at these, everything other than the inheritance is exactly the same. So that's pretty nice. Documentation is generated automatically. Looks nice. So it's all of this is automatically generated. We don't have to do anything, which I think is pretty useful for both engineers and for who want to know what it does, and for our customers. And then when we look at Rails and Phoenix integrating this back in, there's 3 files in Ruby and 3 files in Elixir to basically do the API integration. You have your request adapter, your response adapter, and your router adapter. and everything else is just your application logic. And then as sort of an example of this, rather than building our REST API for one of our services, we took 34 extra lines of code and basically exposed that over WebSockets, and our entire API was available. So, sweet, that's wrapped up.